So I am with Fresh Energy, and Fresh Energy turned 25 years old last year. And it is the only organization in Minnesota that is focused on climate and energy policy action. And we are policy advocates. So we are trying to change laws, make new laws, impose regulations, make sure that they're carried forward at everything from the city level, mostly the state level, and occasionally the national level. And I'm very proud that we have a science-based, data-driven approach. We're trying to make sure that the markets are open for clean energy development in Minnesota. And we want to make sure that the carbon is going down very rapidly, steeply so, and doing that in a way that actually grows clean energy jobs. So I'll be talking about how Minnesota is actually a global success story. The title of this talk is Next Steps on Deep Climate Action, How Can Minnesota Lead? And these are next steps for nations in the world and how you and I can continue to act effectively. I want to tell you that I am very focused, laser focused on deep carbon reductions. That is my mantra, that is my metric. There is so much we can do that will actually reduce carbon emissions that it's really important that we actually track that. And I was discouraged recently when learning about an initiative in Minnesota that here's one thing they track: number of meetings. Number of meetings is not a way to show that you're reducing carbon. It may be a way to get to reducing carbon, but if you're not also inventorying the carbon and counting carbon emissions, you won't know if you're doing as much as you possibly can. So know that that is my bias and Fresh Energy's bias going forward. And the reason for that is we know that we need massive reductions. And we know that we have a responsibility as one of the richest states in the nation and the richest country in the world. And I usually end my talks this way, but I'll begin this way. We are the generation that is the most educated in human history. We're the richest generation in all of human history. We're the best connected generation in human history. So we've got a lot of things going for us. And it is imperative, and I think Anna and I both saw this in Bonn and other global negotiations, that when you're talking to people from much lower income countries, they expect that people from the United States are going to be leading. They want the richest nation in the world to be leading because they understand that we can help drive the price point of carbon solutions down low enough that they can leapfrog over our fossil fuel dependence. And when they get electricity for the first time, it can be clean electricity going forward. So that's my bias. I also have an interesting perspective on this. I go out 60 times a year and give a talk on global warming solutions. And usually I'm not in audiences like this one. I very deliberately try to be in more conservative places and outside the Twin Cities, because I think that's where I can be the most effective. And sometimes people say to me, well, you're working on this thorny problem in a difficult political time. How do you not get discouraged? And actually, the truth is I don't get discouraged. And first of all, it's not my predilection. I don't think despair is a useful sentiment. I'm not someone who gets mired down. I'm not a hand-wringer. I guess I was brought up that way, or it's it's innate in me that I'm interested in focusing on problems that we can do something about. So that's also why I'm interested in how we measure carbon reductions, because I need to know, I am bolstered by success and by group success. And one way to measure that, the clearest way I know, is the carbon going up or is the carbon going down? So I'm going to start you off with this great piece of information for Minnesota. For Minnesota, from 2007 to 2016, a 10-year span, in our electric sector, which is the biggest source of global warming pollution, carbon went down 29% in 10 years. Did you know that? If you didn't know that, chances are the people who represent you in St. Paul and Washington, D.C. don't know it either. So tell them. But you'll also want to pair it with this other statistic. In that same 10-year period, the Minnesota economy grew 29%. So that defies common wisdom, which is that you have to choose between environmental good and economic benefit. And in fact, on energy, there's been a great decoupling, which means that we can cut carbon emissions fast while growing the economy. And I'll give you other examples of that for Minnesota going forward. And I'm also going to lay out for you in a little bit why I think Minnesota is more important than California on climate action. So, but I do want to say a few words about my experience in Bonn compared to other international climate negotiations that I've been at, and this is my 3rd year. So obviously the nations of the world, almost 200 of them gathered in Bonn for about 2 weeks, and their goal was to move forward with the Paris Agreement, which is to strive to hold average global temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And in fact, we are going to see this year a report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change coming out in 2018, a special report outlining the consequences of a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase. And 2 years ago, I was in Paris for the major climate summit that resulted in the Paris Agreement, led by President Obama and President Xi of China working together. So just a few words thinking about the distinction between the Bonn negotiations and the Paris negotiations 2 years before. The gentleman from Fiji, Frank Bainimarama, who was the president of the Conference of Parties in Bonn, he started out the conference with a series of webinars. It's a modern world, so he did a series of webinars talking about what he hoped to accomplish in Bonn. And he pointed out that the Paris Agreement had been France's gift to the world for the sake of all 7.5 billion people on Earth. And he was seeking a renewal of the vision in Paris, especially given the US elections of 2016. We know that President Trump has stated that he intends to exit the Paris Agreement on our behalf, which is a stand-alone position in the world. And his administration certainly is not taking on its commitments for our own nationally determined contribution to cut our own greenhouse gas emissions at home. So the president of the Bonn negotiations said that we need to uphold and advance the Paris Agreement to ensure progress on that agreement and design the process for the meeting in Poland later this year, which will be a check-in on how well countries are doing on their obligations and how they need to ratchet up their ambition. And he also, because he's from a low-lying island nation, Fiji, the first president of these negotiations ever to come from a low-lying island nation, he said we need to build greater resilience for all the vulnerable nations to the impacts of climate change. And he was absolutely committed to using the negotiations to give confidence to the other nations of the world that we are still committed to making the Paris Agreement work together. In fact, it was Germany that made it possible for Fiji to head these climate negotiations. You'll notice they weren't held in Fiji. They were held in Bonn because Bonn had the infrastructure and offered itself up as the host community. And I really like his quote from the opening day. "We who are vulnerable must be heard. No one, no matter who they are or where they live, will ultimately escape the impact of climate change." So I was there observing the US role. And first of all, the concern was, who will President Trump send to represent the United States in a climate negotiation, which would be very telling. And what are his or their intentions at a climate negotiation? And there was a lot of fear and some despair before the negotiations that the Trump administration would try to be obstructive and would use their time. And you can probably, imagine to yourself who the nations of the world might be who could be picked off a climate agreement. Who are the least convinced that they're doing the right thing and most amenable to maybe joining together with the Trump administration. But that did not happen. And part of that was that the U.S. role, actually, it was a very minor role. They did not actively take destructive action. They sent a diplomatic corps, people who had been to the climate negotiations before, and they were doing the work of holding the meetings with the other countries and making decisions. And they were not interfered with. They were quiet about it, but they were not interfered with. And then I was part of a group of about 12 people from the United States who were invited to meet with the US delegation. And we had about an hour to do so, and I was the only Midwesterner there. Isn't that a shame? It was a very kind of coastal-dominated climate summit. I don't know if that was your experience as well, Anna. There were lots of people there from California, Oregon, Washington, Virginia, New York, Massachusetts, including, in most cases, the governors, the head of environmental quality, but not so many people from the Heartland. I'll talk in a moment about why I think that was so critical. So we had an interesting meeting. We were told that it was an off-the-record meeting by the U.S. delegation, and so I can't officially tell you what happened, but I may hint at some of these things going forward. The main guy we spoke with was Francis Brooks, who is quite political and has worked for a number of members of very conservative members of Congress. But we were reaching some agreement on discussion about moving wind power from places in the country that happened to be pretty conservative, like Oklahoma and Kansas, but have a richness of wind power, to places that are much more progressive, but really want that clean energy. So there was at least one small point of agreement. When I do give a slide presentation, I do show an image of a photo I took of the ante-room of the US delegation's meeting room, where there were about a dozen people when we came through to get to our meeting space. And boy, did they look, I don't think it's on our website, but asked me to send you this image. Boy, did they look pretty skeptical as we walked in. But of course, we had been invited by the delegation. That had all been negotiated, that we would meet with them. So at least we had that access. And I'm going to be talking to you about the role of civil society at these summits. So there are the diplomats who come representing countries, and then there is a very large core of the 25,000 people that Anna mentioned who are members of civil society. So we have badges if we're lucky to get them, and we are observers. We obviously are not negotiating anything. And civil society is defined by this part of the UN as including everything from business to environmental groups, faith-based groups, academic groups like the University of Minnesota. Also there were contingents from St. John's and St. Ben's and Carleton and many other places. It's a very broad civil society. And our job as civil society is to keep an eye on what's happening and to call out and call attention back home in our countries when our official delegation is not doing the right thing. So you saw examples of that on social media as this was moving forward. And then there was something brand new at the Bonn negotiations, and it was a matter of, it was something that needed to be created. So Anna and I were at the 23rd International Climate Summit, so the 23 years that this has been going on. It was the first year that the United States did not have an official presence in terms of having a place where you could actually go and talk to someone from the United States, maybe have coffee with someone from the United States and learn about our culture. Every other country had such a place. There was a small rental fee for these booths, but well worth it because it's a chance to sit down and get to know people from all over the world. The Trump administration determined that they didn't want to pay the fee. Wow, it was really disturbing to me when I was walking around going into these areas and saw the booth from Sierra Leone and was invited to sit down for coffee, knowing that my rich country was blowing this off. But I wasn't the only one disturbed by this, and there was some action beforehand. So an organization that formed last summer, so before the US elections, called We Are Still In, hashtag We Are Still In, as in we are still in for the commitment to the Paris Agreement, decided that it was not acceptable for the United States not to have that kind of presence. And so they raised money from private philanthropy to actually create a US Climate Action Center. So it was not funded by the United States government, it was funded by businesses and philanthropy in the United States. And Anna will remember this well, that it was a set of inflated domes, giant domes, big enough to hold 1,000 people, but kind of looked like, they were white, so it kind of looked like you were in an igloo. And it was 5 times larger than any previous United States space at any climate summit. And it was the most popular part for 25,000 people because it was free and open to everyone. And it was the place where there were about 100 United States businesses and non-governmental organizations and alliances there almost 24/7. So it was the place to find out, for a lot of other countries, it was a place to discern, does the Trump administration really stand for anything? Or is there anything going on at the sub-national level that can counteract that? And it was the place where people got together. So we were proud to be that. And the We Are Still In Coalition, you can look them up. It's over 2,500 businesses, many academic institutions, faith organizations, but it's primarily states, cities, but businesses are a big part of it, who have said, we do not support leaving the Paris Agreement. And when I first looked at the list of members of the We Are Still In Coalition, it struck me that one of the large Fortune 500 companies based in Minnesota was on that list. Any idea who it was? Target. Target. So I'm going to be talking a bit about Target. So I want to talk to you about Minnesota's leadership role. And actually we got a whole hour in the global spotlight for Minnesota. And I'll tell you about how that happened. First of all, I want to talk to you about states that matter. Not my term. Of course, all states matter. But I do think that some states matter more at this point in history on deep carbon reduction. And here is my take on this. When states that are on the coast of the United States, some of which have never had a coal-fired power plant, because they've outsourced that, take action on climate change, and also they don't have winter, and also they don't have hot, humid summers, mostly, and maybe they don't have mining. It's a different kind of economy than what we've got here in Minnesota. They're easier places. And at Fresh Energy, we've known that for a long time. We know that whatever happens in California is of little relevance to most policymakers in Minnesota, just because they're seen as being too progressive to be relevant to what we're doing. And I think part of that is true. I talk to people in California all the time, and I think they have great policies. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we are a state that's heavily agricultural, heavily industrial. We have cold winters, we have hot summers, we use a lot of energy for transportation, and historically we've been quite dependent on fossil fuels, certainly oil, but even more so coal. And so when we have to take on the climate challenge, we are starting out at in a much deeper hole than California was. And so, and actually people in other countries understand that too. My husband and I were in Bonn together, and we were hosted by a local couple in Bonn who grew up in that state and had lived all their lives in that state and were very interested in what's happening in the United States. And they knew too that Minnesota is different than the rest than the coastal states because of our heavy carbon footprint and what we're doing about that. So when I got a call about a month before we went to Bonn, inviting Fresh Energy, seeing if we were interested in assembling a panel of spokespeople. And the invitation was for to tell either the Minnesota story of what was happening on carbon reduction or to tell the Midwestern story. I was delighted. And it was from one of the members of this We Are Still In coalition who arranged, I think all told, they arranged 29 one-hour panel discussions in this big igloo that were open to anyone in the world. And so I have to tell you, very quickly I decided against doing a Midwestern panel. And part of that was just practicality. With only an hour, if you're trying to talk about this heterogeneous Midwest, there's too much to get into and you're not really going to be able to focus, and I like focus. And the other thing is currently we're in a tough neighborhood in the Midwest. I have a friend who does climate organizing in the South, and he talks about the South as being a tough neighborhood. It's a different way, a tough neighborhood. But when you're talking about North Dakota and Iowa and Wisconsin and Minnesota, we have very different approaches. And I wanted to focus in, and I wanted to demonstrate to other countries that we were talking to that in the United States, in the difficult heartland like Minnesota, that we are starting to take climate action, and we are proving that you can do it while growing great jobs and growing the economy as a whole. So here's what we assembled. We called our forum U.S. Heartland, the U.S. Heartland, Minnesota Leadership on Deep Carbon Reduction. And we were the only state at the Bonn negotiations that had a panel of 5 people representing the governor's office, the legislature. We had Representative Melissa Hortman, the minority leader in the legislature, a nonprofit like Fresh Energy, and then 2 businesses that are quite different. And the only criteria I had for anyone who wanted to be on our panel was, can you show me deep carbon reductions? That's what I wanted. So I had other people saying, well, why aren't we on your panel? Like, well, bring the deep carbon reductions and next time you'll be on our panel. But remember, this is the time when we have to show the rest of the world that we're taking this on. And so we invited the only business I know in Minnesota. It happens to be a nonprofit business, the Science Museum of Minnesota. The only business I know that has cut its heating needs 75% with a 3-year payback. So they are saving the museum $300,000 a year, and they're using technology that was built in the Midwest from the Train Corporation to do that. And you better believe that the board of directors of the Science Museum loves it, that they have an extra $300,000 a year that they're not wasting on energy because they don't need it. And instead they're using it for their program. And the program at the Science Museum includes getting girls into STEM education. So I love that mission, and that's being supported there. And just to give you a sense, the Science Museum talked in Bonn about how on February 7th last year, when I think it was 2 degrees in St. Paul, they got a call from their energy manager saying, well, you know what, we haven't needed to turn on the heat today because we are reusing waste heat using smart mechanical engineering. And people in Bonn gasped because they think of us as unlivable anyway because of our cold weather. And then we had a representative from Target who talked about a couple of very innovative things that Target is up to. Now, Target uses a lot of energy. Target has only United States stores. Those stores use a lot of energy. But did you know Target has a couple of interesting goals? One of which that gets the most applause is that they have a goal to get solar photovoltaic systems on 500 of their rooftops of stores. And they have accomplished this so far in over 350 stores, including my store on University Avenue in Midway. And then some smart team members at Target have thought to take that a little farther, which I noticed in my Target store. Because here's the thing, great location for solar energy, nice flat roofs that otherwise aren't working hard enough, but it's a flat roof. So if you don't know it's there and you're not in a helicopter, and I'm never going to Target in a helicopter so far, you kind of, even if you do what I do for a living, you kind of forget that it's there. until I was at customer service one day and noticed a big sign that somebody had put up saying, we have solar on the roof, and last month this is how much energy we produced, this is how much carbon we cut, and this is how much water we saved as a result. And that was fabulous. And that should be replicated in your target too, if it's not already. So it's a way that we can make visible deep carbon reduction going forward. But that's actually not the most interesting thing about what Target's trying to do, because they have actually announced that their goal is to run their US operations on 100% renewable energy as soon as possible. And the benefit for those of us who don't work for Target is when a large corporation puts in big orders like that, it decreases the price and increases the availability for the rest of us. So it helps drive the market. I call it corporate policy that can be paired with state policy going forward. So very innovative and very interesting. Target actually is working with most of the other 17 Fortune 500 businesses that are based in Minnesota. And we told that to people in Bonn too, and they were like, wait a minute, little Minnesota is home to 17 Fortune 500s, and I just feel bad that we used to have more. And they're working with medium and small size companies and the University of Minnesota on, and their goal jointly is how can they all get 100% renewable energy? And so they are starting to do something that has never happened before in the history of utilities. And that is when the biggest customers of Xcel Energy or Minnesota Power or Great River Energy go to their utility and say, we want 100% renewable energy. Pretty much tomorrow. That's a disruptive influence, but it's something that usually cannot be ignored. I know that there are utilities in some parts of Minnesota and around the country that are trying to ignore this clean energy revolution, part of which is being driven by corporations. But the smart utilities are trying to figure out how to keep those customers and how to supply them with 100% renewable energy. So very, very interesting. And then I told the story in Bonn about, because Xcel Energy wasn't there. They never go to international negotiations like this. Never seen them there. I wish they were there. But I was happy to tell their story because it's something that Fresh Energy and our partners made happen. So first of all, I told the story about Minnesota policy. Remember I gave those statistics? I started the talk by talking about 29% carbon reductions in the power sector. That was made possible by the state's Renewable Energy Standard and our Next Generation Energy Act, which set goals that are based on science for carbon reduction across the Minnesota economy. And the Renewable Energy Standard is a requirement that anyone who sells electricity in Minnesota must get to at least 25% new renewables by 2025. And every one of those utilities leading up to that policy said it couldn't be done. Some of them had lobbyists who actually said that if you tried to get to 25% renewable energy on our energy system, the lights would not be on. And I don't think this was a utility lobbyist, but maybe somebody from the chamber said, at the legislature, said, if you pass this policy, Minnesotans will move to South Dakota. And my apologies to our, we have a South Dakotan in the audience. But we haven't actually seen that out-migration to South Dakota. In fact, it sometimes seems to be the other direction. But now every one of our utilities is meeting that standard ahead of schedule. Minnesota Power met it 10 years early, Great River Energy met it 8 years early, so did Xcel Energy. And now the partial Minnesota success story is with that policy. In 10 years, we went from 2/3 reliance on coal. Now we get less than 39% of our power from coal in 10 years. And what has picked up the slack, what is providing us with this power, is currently we have 18% of this power is coming from the wind. I understand there is some solar panels on this building too, so there's probably some solar as well. And so what used to be a predominance of coal is now shifting rapidly toward renewable energy. And the coal has been backed down as a result in just about 10 years. So in fact, Xcel Energy, which is our biggest utility in Minnesota, half the power, will get to 33% wind in their system by 2021 in just a couple years, 33% wind. and by 2030, 60% wind. And the reason I was talking about Xcel in Bonn is that a couple of years ago, Fresh Energy and our partners went to Xcel and said, you have to close down these coal plants. They are some of the biggest carbon polluters in the entire Midwest, by far more important than what the Hamilton household or the Johnson household puts into our atmosphere, is burning coal. And they said, yeah, you're right, maybe we'll look at it in 2030. Seriously, that's what their document said in January 2015. Not, I'm being a little snarky, but the document, talked about their biggest, the Sherco 3 plant, which is the largest source of global warming pollution in the Midwest, in 8 states, and said, in 2015, it said, well, in 2030, we'll look at that plant and see if it's time to retire it. Well, that didn't strike us as acceptable. And so we actually raised some money so that we could run the same analytical model that Xcel runs. And we needed to prove to the state that you could keep the lights on, keep electricity prices affordable, and retire those coal plants early and replace them with massive amounts of clean energy, wind and solar and energy efficiency especially. And it took us about 90 days to run that model. And we were actually able to show that unlike Xcel, we could save about $60 million and we could close down those coal plants early. So we filed that plan. We called our plan the Clean Energy Plan. And then there was the Xcel plan. And guess what? In 90 days, Xcel Energy essentially rescinded their original plan and filed a new plan calling for retiring those 2 massive coal plants and replacing them with clean energy. And here's what their CEO said. It's in our customers' business interest to do this because it's the cheapest thing we can do. And so they computed that because of what we helped start and what they adopted, by 2030, their system would be 60% carbon free. That's about twice what the Paris Agreement says. And so that was about 2 years ago. But just before we went to Bonn, Xcel's CEO said to the state of Minnesota, because the prices of wind and solar are coming down so fast, and we are putting so much of it onto our system, we're going to meet our 2030 goals 8 years early. Now, some companies would say we're meeting them 8 years early, give us a round of applause. They actually went on to say we're going to meet the 2030 goals by 2022. And then they set new goals for themselves. Nobody forcing them to do this. And their goal now is by 2030, they will be 85% carbon free, which is about 3 times the Paris Agreement. Now, why am I using that as a metric? When President Trump is threatening to leave the Paris Agreement, but you have 2,500 big and small and medium companies in Bonn saying, we want to stay in, we want those opportunities from clean energy, and some of those companies are actually achieving now the 3 times the Paris Agreement. That's what the rest of the world wants to see. Because they don't just expect the United States to meet the Paris Agreement. We have to blow it out of the water. We have to do much better. And we have to lead the way so that other countries have a chance. So I was proud to tell those stories going forward. And then I told people in Bonn, here is the other interesting thing that's happening because of strong carbon reduction policy. Minnesota so far has created 57,000 clean energy jobs. Did you know that? There's going to be an inventory done in the next couple of years, and I'm sure it'll be much higher than that. So at least 57,000 clean energy jobs. Here is what I like about them. They're in every county in Minnesota. 30% of them are in greater Minnesota, and they pay on average 42% higher than the state average wage. And here's another kicker for those clean energy jobs. Starting in 2000, if you looked at the Minnesota economy and took it out to about the year 2014, that's all we have data from so far, 2000 to 2014, And you know that there was a deep recession centered around 2008, 2009. But even so, Minnesota jobs grew about 11%. Jobs overall. Clean energy jobs grew 78%. And that's still happening, that the amount of job creation in clean energy is 4 to 7 times faster than overall jobs in any year, year after year in Minnesota. So it's what some people are calling the clean energy revolution. I love that. So, what are the next steps? Now, I do not want you to have the impression that because we have some corporate leadership and because some utilities helped by being pushed analytically by advocates like Fresh Energy and using the regulatory process to do that, that things are taken care of. But what I want you to know is you have lots of friends. You have lots of friends in many parts of Minnesota and in many parts of our economy that are starting to speak up. And you should thank them when they do that, and thank them especially when they take actual deep carbon reduction actions, and ask the others why they're not doing the same thing. And by the way, I haven't mentioned Walmart, but they're putting solar on their stores too. I just happened to shop at a Target, so and Walmart is not based in Minnesota. So we need to be sure that this transition happens much more rapidly. So we need to move. Another moniker that was used at the climate summit was we will move farther, faster together. If we work together, which I also really like. And the best praise that we got for our Minnesota panel on the global stage was the leaders of these 29 sessions called us up and said, yours was the best because you were the only state at the whole conference that was able to show business members, corporations, nonprofits, the governor's office, and the legislative branch working together with a focus on deep carbon reduction. And they understood there's a difference between making a pledge to do something and actually doing it. I think there's a little too much emphasis these days on pledges. Getting cities to pledge to do things especially troubles me because cities don't have control over energy. So we're in the city of Minneapolis now. If the city of Minneapolis pledges to do something on renewable energy and forgets about that big coal plant that's providing most of their power but is not based in the city of Minneapolis, they're not being responsible to the rest of Minnesota, and they're not being honest with themselves. We have to make sure we have to move forward in Minnesota. We need to move forward faster together. Another example, I brought you those Global Warming 101 handouts and said, leave them lying around the cabin this summer. And I was only partly in jest there. Some of us in Minnesota, I don't happen to own a cabin, but I know a lot of people in Minnesota who do, and many of those people actually have 2 utility companies. So as you're trying to see, what is it this Xcel Energy is doing right and what is it not, what could it improve on, compare it to your utility or compare it to the utility that provides the power at your cabin. I bet that utility is a little bit more conservative. And we need all the utilities to be decarbonizing as rapidly as possible. Specifically, we need to get on a path where in the near future, we're getting our energy, about 50% of it's going to come from the wind. About 20 to 30% of it will come from solar energy. And for a while, we're going to need to use some natural gas or some nuclear power or something else, hopefully zero carbon, until we get the price of storage for when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining down far enough, fast enough, that we can have it be 100% renewable energy, but we need to get on that path. And please never let anyone dissuade you from being 80% carbon free or 85% carbon free like our biggest utility. What I've said to some people is, did you know your utility company is going to get to be 85% carbon free and you didn't need to lift a finger to make that happen? That means you have time and your fingers have energy to do other things, which is to make sure that the other utilities are doing it, one thing. Make sure the other utility, I'm using the example of the utility that serves your cabin or your farm, is doing it as well. Make sure every business that you buy products from is moving toward 100% renewable energy. Why wouldn't they be? In fact, some of those businesses who are doing that because they've surveyed their customers and they've surveyed millennials. And their interest as companies is, how do I get a great workforce? How do I get great workers? Wonderful people who are going to want to stay with my company. And when they ask young people what they want every product they buy in the near future to be manufactured using wind and or sun. It's just a given. It's an expectation. And they are not wrong. They are right to have that expectation. And we need to meet that expectation. And people want to work for a company that's using all renewable energy as well. So we have that corporate pressure, which is very, very interesting going forward. And then we have other opportunities. Now, I've been saying some good things about my power company because I like what they're proving out. But I also know this. I'm a clean energy advocate. And I know, here I'll give you an example. The CEO of Xcel Energy, who I met in the White House, we both got invited by President Obama a couple years ago. We met each other in the White House, although we're both in Minnesota. Ben Folk is his name. Here's what he said publicly, and he says it on Minnesota Public Radio every couple of months. He says, the cheapest electron we can provide our customers is by building a new wind plant. And it is cheaper than just buying the coal for a coal plant that's already amortized. Did you know that? So here's a couple of things to think about there. That means we don't have to wait. We can hasten the clean energy revolution because it's already outperforming. And it means we should be asking every other utility executive, why aren't you taking advantage of this cheap energy? Why aren't you buying more wind when the power company in the next county has figured it out that it's in the best interest of their customers going forward? Why aren't you doing that going forward? But here's the other thing to think about. Remember, I'm an advocate for a living. And by the way, that statement, the cheapest thing we can buy, followed by the statement, coal is on its way out. It's just a matter of time. That's not my words. That's the words of Ben Folk. And he said it to his shareholders at their annual meeting in Eau Claire, Wisconsin in April of last year. That's no shrinking violet to say it to his shareholders. Remember, he owns coal plants. And so the owner of the coal plants is saying, there's a different sheriff in town, and the economy is telling us that we need to shift, and he's decarbonizing. But you're no fools. If the CEO of a major corporation tells you what he can do in 5 years or 15 years, he's very sure he can do that, which means he can do more than that. Big smile on my face. It means they can do more than that. And or they can do it faster than that. Because that's what the history of energy prices tells us. So when he is committing to something, he's committing to something he is sure that he can accomplish. So push for more. But also, just because he said it doesn't mean that there aren't other forces working to tamp that desire down. I can imagine there may be some interesting conversations at the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce about that. Just guessing about that commitment, because it's definitely not the status quo. So we need to make sure that that vision is accomplished, and then we need to push forward. So that's another thing that we can do. And here's the interesting thing. I was describing to you how in 10 years, because of strong state policy that every utility worked against and now embraces, we are starting to decarbonize the electric system. In no other sector of the economy have we found substitutes for fossil fuels that are cost effective. So if we're going to tackle global warming, we have to tackle it in all the sectors. since there's no cost-effective substitutions for most of the rest of the economy, we are going to need to plug more things into the electric system. And that's okay, because as it goes to zero carbon, we should be using more of that. And it's actually creating more jobs and creating opportunities in the clean energy sector. So we call this, and many other people call this, Electrify Everything. So the first thing to be electrified, it's already begun, is electric vehicles. So replacing the internal combustion engine with electric vehicles. Now I know you might think, you know, there's an awful lot of discussion about what Elon Musk and Tesla is doing. The most interesting thing to me about Tesla is their work on mass production of great batteries, because that battery technology, as it becomes more cost effective, is going to be useful, trust me, in a lot more interesting things than in fast cars. And it's going to be useful in helping us heat and cool our homes using electricity rather than using natural gas. And already we switched in our house, the Hamilton household, from heating our hot water with natural gas. Now we heat it with wind power, and you can do it too. So as you're trying to decarbonize. So we need to be electrifying everything. Electric vehicles, the US Department of Energy says that Minnesota by 2030 will have 1 million electric vehicles. So there's going to be a sea change. Internal combustion engine is a thing of the past. Chances are very good that your next car or 2 cars down the road are going to be electric vehicles, and you are going to love them because they won't make noise, they won't stink, they won't be polluting, and they will be, they have many fewer moving parts than the internal combustion engine, so they need much less maintenance, and they're just fun to drive. So we have a long way to go. We have about 7,500 electric vehicles now in Minnesota, so it's a long trajectory. But we're starting to get the electric companies interested in, my goodness, with electric vehicles, we could actually be growing our customers. Wouldn't that be a good thing for our electric company? And then we're also working with them, Xcel specifically, saying, you know, for Xcel, Metro Transit gets its power for is in the Xcel service territory. So what if those buses were not running on diesel in a few years, but were electric buses? Now we're away from doing that, but what some smart cities are doing, and what the Twin Cities should do, what the Met Council should do, who runs Metro Transit, is to say what Calgary did. Calgary is in an energy intensive part of the world, but the city of Calgary has announced that by 2020 they will no longer be buying diesel buses. It's going to take a while to turn over the fleet, but they're going to be adding electric vehicles going forward. And that's a smart thing to do. We should do that too. We have a little incentive coming to Minnesota in the next couple of years. Anyone heard about Volkswagen and emissions testing? Well, there's a big Volkswagen settlement, and some of those dollars are coming to Minnesota. And the Pollution Control Agency has been doing, I think, a bang-up job of going all around the state and taking an unprecedented amount of public comment on how we should use that money. And what it seems to be coming down to is 2 interesting uses that relate to this talk. And one of them is for electric vehicles. Outside of the metro area, there's not too many places to charge them fast. And so we should use some of that money in greater Minnesota to set up a network of fast charging stations. And some of the smart communities out there were commenting to the Pollution Control Agency saying, and they're thinking wisely because they've seen bad things happen in their communities, and they're saying, oh, and by the way, we don't want the fast charging station to be out on the highway. We want it to be in town so that as people are fast charging, they're going to the cafe and maybe they're shopping at the Family Dollar and they're contributing, they're part of the community rather than bypassing the community. And that's a smart way to do that. So it's interesting to think about that. It's kind of like broadband, how to bring something that makes the rest of Minnesota connected to all of us. We all need to be connected. And then here's the other thing, and this is an environmental justice, climate justice part of the talk. That the places that need electric buses most are the places where people's kids have high asthma rates because of poor air quality. And those people don't necessarily own cars themselves because they're lower income and they have lots of buses running through their community. So some of the VW settlement dollars for Minnesota should go for buying electric vehicles, and the first places they should run is on routes in North Minneapolis. That's the first place. And because remember, you want to track your carbon reduction and you want to see where it's going to be having the most, making the most difference going forward. So other things that you can do, I hope that you'll help me with my focus on deep carbon reduction. You can sign up for a once-a-month global warming action newsletter if you're not already on it, and it's over on the table. And we'll just send you a one-page email once a month telling you what big decisions are being made and how you can weigh in. And sometimes we do something really fun, like here's a really good positive decision that somebody made, and we'll tell you which decision maker made it so you can call them up and thank them, which is a nice action you can take. People forget about those kinds of actions going forward. And then I want to beseech you, our newest project is with health professionals and health students. We're going to do in Minnesota the first conference on, it's called Code Blue for Planet Earth. It's about health implications of climate change and what we can do about it. It's sponsored by the Abbott Northwestern Hospital Foundation. It's going to be at the Science Museum of Minnesota on April 20th. If you are a health professional or know one, a nurse, a doctor, someone in public health, please have them come to our website and come to this conference. There's actually a special rate for students, only $10 for students because we want them there. We know that it's going to fill fast. We opened registration about 2 weeks ago, and we almost have half the registration filled. So it's another example of how Fresh Energy does its work. And you know, here's why I do this. Like Anna, I grew up as a kid who loved the environment, loved being outside, and wanted to do something concrete. And when I see all of these very cool things happening, and I get frustrated because not enough people know about them, that's why I'm out here tonight, to make sure you know about them. It's actually very hard to keep current on this talk because there's always something new happening. So follow me on Facebook or Twitter because I tell people what's happening, because I want you to help spread the word about what's happening. What I have found is the biggest impediment to people taking positive action on climate change is they think it's going to be expensive or they don't see any solutions. And we are talking about very positive solutions, and I hope you'll continue to be part of it. I'd love